got to tell you guys about a few new products over at our favorite CBD store. That's, of course, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The first thing I'm going to tell you about that's brand new over there is these THCV gummies. There's 10 milligrams of THCV per gummy and 10 gummies per jar. A lot of y'all are probably familiar with this THCV. Some people call it diet weed. It's very good for intermittent fasters. THCV helps suppress or dull your appetite, which, of course, a little bit unlike regular THC that, as you probably know, or at least you've heard, can give you the munchies. THCV helps promote energy, unlike regular THC, which, of course, makes you feel kind of mellow. This is legal, oh my God, legal under the Farm Bill. So thank you, Farm Bill. The second thing I want to tell you about that's new over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com is their full spectrum nano CBD soft gels. These have the perfect amount of CBD with THC. 25 milligrams of CBD and 0.27 milligrams of THC per soft gel. Their everyday formula brings your body back to homeostasis and adds this nice extra layer of chill. I like that. I think you do too. A lot of us need that now and again, or maybe every day. Nanotechnology allows better absorption into your body, even better than their other products, which was already amazing. Again, this has a calming effect and it lasts about 6 to 8 hours. And of course, like the other stuff, it's legal under what? The Farm Bill. Thank you, Farm Bill. It's legal. I would not get you guys in trouble. Go over to PalomaVerdeCBD.com. They've got a lot of great products. I talk about them all the time. The massage oil. They've got the sleep bundle. They got nano CBD soft gels, CBD bath bombs, which are amazing. Gummies, tinctures, all of that stuff. Of course, for my French bulldogs, Lux and George, the pet tinctures and the pet gummies. All of these things are over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Oh yeah, did I tell you about the cool menthol sports cream? Of course I have before. It's the best sports cream in the world. I get reviews from customers on this all the time. That's the number one thing I like from this company. And they've got all of these great things. Over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com, you will get a promo code because Carlos and Vanessa, the owners, love this show and they want to help out the listeners of this show. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order. Go give them business and in turn, give me business. Now, let's get back to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
Welcome back, you guys, once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you here with me again this week. And man, oh man, thank you for all of the feedback from last week's episode with David Patrick Harry. That was among the best feedback I've ever received for any episode. So in case you missed it, go watch it on YouTube or listen to it on the podcast feed. Apparently, that was quite the impactful episode for a lot of people. I agree. I think it was too. I'm glad you guys thought so. And I told you at the top of that one that I want to continue to bring you similar topics, the same topics. We will revisit certain topics as I always have, and maybe provide even some more nuance or a more expanded macro view of some of these things. Like today, we're talking about wokeism, woke progressivism. It's stuff we've covered before. And of course, if you just want the quick blurb, you could turn on Fox News and hear that woke people are crazy. Can you believe what they're doing on college campuses? Oh my. But there's a lot more to it than that. And we're going to dive deep into, maybe we could call it the theology of the woke today with Noelle Mering. She's very, very, very good on this subject, like a pro, you might say. And my friend Gabe out in Oregon is the one that pointed me in her direction. So thank you, Gabe. My listeners are going to thank you too, because this is a great deep dive into the wokeism, the woke religion, the woke progressivism. We see it all around us, but I want you guys to understand some of the layers that are involved here. And again, the nuance that's involved. It's not just that they're crazy or insane. I mean, that's part of it, but let's dive deeper than that surface layer of this topic. And with me today to do just that is someone who's excellent at doing just that. Noelle Mering, welcome to the show, ma'am. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to get into, obviously, the book you wrote, Awake Not Woke, your very good at talking about this subject. And I like it because a lot of people know kind of about wokeism and wokeness and these things. And even the fact that it comes from the Frankfurt School is gaining popularity and understanding. But you, unlike a lot of people, also discuss the spiritual warfare aspect of a lot of this stuff. And I think that's important. And I've been trying to do topics where we understand the face value and why things are bad, or this is getting crazy, or these people are nuts. But it doesn't just end there. And I like to get the spiritual warfare aspect of these type of topics down. So I want to get into all of this stuff. And I know you're great at that. Before we do, for those listening that aren't familiar with your work, tell them who you are and what you do and whatever type of intro you'd like to give for yourself.
Well, thanks so much. It's so fun to be here. I am a wife and a mother of 6 children, ages 22 down to 10. And I've been writing for the last several years, started around 2018, writing about the woke movement in particular around that year. I've co-authored 3 books now in a book series called Theology of Home. Actually, our 3rd one's coming out this week, possibly getting our copies today. So I'm hoping that comes today. So those is seemingly a very big pivot going from Theology of Home, which is, books with beautiful photography and, meditations on the meaning of home and why we all long for home and what that means and why it's such a universal longing, and looking at home as a foretaste of heaven. And then I wrote this book about the woke movement. So, but they actually, I think, are connected, that they're 2 sides of one coin, both kind of trying to fight sort of a nihilism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This modern ideology is inflicted on us, just fighting that sort of nihilistic ideology in 2 different ways. So then I went on to write Awake Not Woke, and that came out last year in 2021 of May, and have just been doing lots of stuff like this, interviews and speeches and talks, and hearing more from people who are really battling this, kind of in their families and school districts and communities. And yes, a lot of rupture. So that's kind of created even more urgency, I think, in just trying to help with any sort of healing that can come from kind of people sort of identifying this movement and then resisting it. So I'm also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center with many amazing people. I'm so just honored to be there too. So yeah, it's been a bunch of different things happening and a lot of fun as well.
Do you get pushback or threats or anything like that? People are sometimes afraid to speak out about some of this stuff, or cancellations or just attacks from weird various angles. Do you get any of that?
I've gotten my share of kind of hate mail or, hate on social media, that type of thing. I've never been threatened, nor have I really felt threatened. I mean, certainly that's on my mind that could happen at some point. And there's a lot of, anger and, this is a pretty controversial subject matter. So I'm not sure what that'll feel like if it turns into something like that, where I felt, unsafe or that my family was threatened. But I have not as of yet, thanks be to God. So I don't feel a sense of fear, I guess. I like
Good.
talking about this type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
To my mind, the consequences for not speaking out are far worse than the consequences for speaking out. But maybe talk to me later. If I think the consequences get more dire, then maybe I'll feel a little bit more afraid or feel differently.
You mentioned anger surrounding this issue. It seems like a lot of people that I guess could broadly be considered in the woke movement, they're driven by anger, it seems like, at least from my perspective. For those listening, I tease some of my boomer listeners, like, you guys are going to start to get some of this at some point. The boomers now get what woke is, but just in case there's some that kind of have a vague idea about it and maybe aren't sure how to articulate it, what's a quick definition if they're listening going, what exactly does woke mean? How would you describe it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a true to form ideology, meaning it takes partial truths and totalizes them into like this all-consuming filter through which we look at reality. I think it changes the nature of reality from being based on being and, as Christians, we would say based on love, to one that's pivoted on power, where all of our relationships, our friendships, our institutions, every dynamic, every motivation is sort of one of a power struggle. So it creates this sort of antagonism at the core of all of our relationships and institutions. I think it identifies the goal for each human person to be one of liberation from oppressive identity groups outside of ourselves, but also liberation from the oppression of the moral law. And so that's where you see kind of the two twin goals of like bringing us into a collectivist mindset where we really define ourselves based on where we sit on the line of oppressors, oppressed, but then also defining ourselves in our ability to transgress the moral law. So, really this is where queer theory comes into play, kind of triumphing over the oppression of normality, that there's sexual norms and societal norms, that really a part of our freedom is in defying those and creating a new norm where everything abnormal becomes the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, I think it is a movement targeted against authority, the concept of authority, any sort of hierarchy. So it's rooted in Marxism and I think Freudianism, along with postmodernism. But I think that's it in a nutshell. So it tends to be surrounding, the hot-button issues, race, sex, sexuality, gender, and defining us into further and further levels of division through those categories.
I think a tricky aspect of it, and maybe this is why it's easy to pull people in, is that do you think it kind of pulls at heartstrings a little bit to where a normal person might think, you see the George Floyd incident or something like this, and a normal person might think, well, I'm sympathetic to that. I don't want to see a person of color get destroyed by a cop or rioting. Or you see some of these things, and I think a normal working individual feels some pull towards that. That does seem wrong. But then it seems to play on that pulling at the heartstrings empathy or something and pull you into something that's an inversion of the truth, in my opinion. Is that like a sales tactic or something you think that's used in this? Or is that just kind of part of the makeup of what wokeism is?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really deliberate manipulation tactic, honestly. And it's effective because, most people, they're not steeped in all the literature, the intellectual genealogy of this movement, don't really see how compassion becomes weaponized in that way. But it is compelling, particularly I think for Christians it has been, because I think we are called to be people who walk with the marginalized, walk with people who are suffering, who we believe in redemption, we believe in healing, we believe that we're all sinners. And, so all these things create a disposition to kind of look at stories of people suffering and want to lead with and possibly only with love, even if that means suppressing things that are true. But we talked about rage earlier, and I think there's a real connection there, that appeal to compassion, but also an appeal to rage. And that insofar as we can, that's a really deliberate tactic too. And I think it's connected to that sense of compassion, that insofar as you can wake people up, form their consciousness to the misery of their lives and make them feel helpless to kind of improve or to get beyond or to heal, then you create people who are willing to kind of blow things up, willing to rage against the system. You create perfect revolutionaries. And part of that is by those sort of narratives that are, repeated and elevated and that drown out any other objection. These narratives of injustice, narratives of suffering. And it's so compelling because there's a real truth there, right? There is real injustice. There are real human sufferings. But I don't think that we see clearly how much those partial truths, once totalized, turn into something that is really a weaponization and a manipulation and preying upon people of goodwill.
This has its roots decades and decades ago. In your research, when did this kind of blossom into what it is now? It seems, I'm prior to 2016, I suppose things just seem different. The lens I use now to look at modern history is much different than it was in 2016. But it seems like that's, to me, when this blew up. Was it prior to that? In your research, what have you found on that?
Well, it's tricky to pinpoint because it really has been, a long march through the institutions. There's books that have been seeded through, for example, like education theory, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, The Politics of Education, that are really incredibly radical books and really religious in their undertones, creating a new religion that is, I think, fundamentally atheistic and self-deifying. And those became pretty mainstreamed somewhere in the 80s. A lot happened in the 80s with institutionalizing more of the queer theory, but also these educational theories, intersectionality. Those are late 80s, early 90s that they became more and more institutionalized. So, but of course, there's a history that goes way back before that too. And certainly in the 60s, there was a lot happening with Marcuse and figures like that were hugely influential in our institutions. But you're right. There is something, 2016, I think, was a pivotal year. I mean, certainly 2020 was, and things escalated even more. But I think politically, there was stuff happening, obviously, in 2016 that drew a lot of divisions onto the surface and kind of made people a bit more raw, in various ways, and more militant too. So I think that's a good year to say that, if you weren't aware of it before 2016, that was understandable. But once 2016 hit, and certainly 2020, I think pretty much everyone realized, okay, I can kind of sweep this under the rug, but actually this is a movement that's, I'm going to have to know more about and try to grapple with. And George Floyd, certainly that was a really pivotal event. And I think that's when people really started paying attention to Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter had been around for a while before then, but that's when, you see people start looking at their What We Believe page and seeing, that some of their goals were queering the culture and disrupting the traditional family unit. And, said that I think a lot of people are scratching their heads, about trying to figure out what that had to do with racial justice. But people were sitting up and paying more attention, I think, at that point.
Yeah, my parents are evangelical, and there was a moment early on where their pastor said something along the lines of, well, we're going to be part of this BLM march. It was shortly after the George Floyd incident. And my dad had already looked into it. And he said, he reached out to the pastor later on and said, you might want to look at their website. I'm not sure that's the organization that you think it might be, because again, they're good at selling, hey, it's about Black lives, right? And when you go and look at some of the stuff on the site, not quite so much. And you write in your book that there's two types of people within the woke movement: misguided, who mean well, and then true believers. And I think if anyone who studied elite theory, there's always going to be a few in control of the many. And I assume that it's kind of the minority of true believers driving this movement. Is that how basically this is? And are the rest of them kind of well-meaning? Are they idiot dupes to an extent? How does that work? And which group's more dangerous in your mind?
Those are great questions. I think in some ways it's probably a spectrum more than, I know I should say two groups, but, I think there's probably a wide spectrum where some people just feel like, okay, yeah, I should probably vaguely, associate myself with this because it seems like the right thing to do. And then there's people who, are increasingly, they're still kind of, I think, being manipulated, but they really are just goodwill people, but they're becoming increasingly militant. So, it's probably a bit more of a spectrum than hardline two groups. And which is more dangerous? Well, I think you're absolutely right that there is radical minority can really drive and does drive, I think, the energy and the trajectory of the movement. That famous phrase of useful idiots, as harsh as it sounds, there's a truth there that they're using people who don't fully understand the implications of what it is they're endorsing. And I think that they're good at creating a sense of urgency. After George Floyd died, I remember immediately the phrase anti-racism came out and exploded, right? And that's when Ibram X. Kendi became really big and Robin DiAngelo got more in people's radars. But that phrase even, that creates a sense of urgency in people because it's because of the fact that it's a true phrase. We should be anti-racist. We should be against things that are racist, without realizing that there's a militancy for the application that includes a whole host of ideology. So certainly it seems like the radicals is the obvious answer for who's more dangerous because they are driving it, because it's a little bit more or maybe a lot more alarming to think that people who have the full understanding of what this ideology represents are proponents of it. It's more sympathetic to think, well, they just don't understand. And so they're supporting something that's, I think, truly evil, but they don't really know. It's negligence. But of course, there's another way in which, we can be culpably ignorant, right? That there's a negligence there can be a negligence to our ignorance at some point. And, I think we're getting to a point where if we're still ignorant about the true tenets of the ideology, then, we're kind of responsible for that too, because this is something that's affecting us so broadly and deeply that there really is a duty, I think, to understand it. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, but I guess I would have to say that the radicals are the more dangerous.
Okay. What's the ultimate goal here? Sometimes I have a hard time trying to figure out, is this person a true believer? Do they actually think, yes, the society is ruled by racist people, and that's what they're trying to break down? Or is it a goal to remake society into some type of egalitarian utopia, which is impossible, as we all know? at the top, the true believers, what are they true believers in? Is it true believing that we need to, again, remake this entire society? Are they using the racism thing as an excuse of just their further destruction?
Well, I think that a lot of them are avowed Marxists. Certainly some of the pivotal people of BLM have publicly say that they're trained Marxists. The goal of equity is a pretty outspoken goal of many of the, more radical in the movement, and it is a Marxist goal, certainly. So, I think the goal is to blow, there's a certain way in which you're revolutionary because you think that there's a duty to keep blowing things up, blowing up systems until you can, achieve some sort of perfection of society, a heaven on earth, the immortization of the eschaton, I think Eric Vogelin calls it. And that's really animated by like a sort of religious type of fervor. So, I think that they will keep going until things are destroyed because that heaven on earth we know can't be achieved. But there's not really a limiting principle once you adopt the ideology of revolution, that Hegelian kind of movement towards perfection. I mean, I think that's what people are trying to kind of scratching their heads about now, in particular with like the feminists versus the transgender movement. That J.K. Rowling and the tennis player Navratilova, they're saying they were the revolutionaries of their time. They were the feminists and they were progressive. And I think what they're grappling with now is that, as soon as you progress to a certain point, that point almost immediately becomes regressive. You have to keep going. There's a instinct to not want to be the last person who's kind of still the dinosaur, right? And so it creates this kind of fervor to keep pushing the envelope. So I think they'll keep going unless it is stopped, either by, just being overcome politically and culturally and through communities and society resisting this, or, through conversion, obviously. I think that people can be converted out of this ideology, but I don't see a way out other than those two options, or maybe a combination of the two, converting hearts and also strong resistance and opposition.
I know a lot of us, including myself, are a little bit worried about where things are going financially with this economy and all of these things. I've got the spot for you to go and get some help with this. And it's free. It is free, Free, which is a good thing with inflation the way it is. Upcoming, it's an online summit by my friend Mikkel Thorup from expatmoney.com with over 30 experts who are focused on moving your life, business, and wealth offshore. It's at expatmoneysummit.com. That is expatmoneysummit.com. I'm going to tell you the best part about this entire thing at the end of this ad. A beloved figure in our movement will be in attendance to help you guys talk through some of these things, but stay tuned. The topics there include securing your own Plan B safe haven, how to use foreign currencies, offshore banking, and decentralized finance to safeguard your money, how to legally reduce your tax burden, how and where to safely store gold, silver, and other precious metals, where the best countries in the world are to find freedom for yourself and your family, how you can get a second passport to travel the globe without restrictions and get in and out of different countries' borders. You will learn about a libertarian island haven, private cities, communities on the ocean, and food and energy independent towns in Latin America. You can register now for free at expatmoneysummit.com. Guess who's going to be in attendance at this event? Ron Paul, the greatest politician. I don't even like using that word for him. The greatest man to ever grace the halls of Congress in this country, the beloved, the wonderful Ron Paul will be a part of this. This is your way to fight back against what is happening in the world, stand up, protect yourself, and find out how to secure your new life abroad. Register now for free, expatmoneysummit.com. Let's get back to the show. Have you seen a lot of the conversion in your, let's say, media tours where you're doing shows, and do people reach out to you because of your book saying, this is so accurate, I was this way and I'm not now? Do you actually see some of that?
I see it more from kind of the people who are in the less radical group, people who just were reacting and just thought that this was the right application of their Christianity or their compassion. I hear a lot from people like that who thought, I started just becoming quietly uncomfortable with the direction things were going. And I think we're seeing that even, with this in the school board meetings. A lot of those parents are not particularly conservative or even religious, that there's a real discomfort, I think, just with people who are willing to look at something objectively and say, they're not so tied to their ideology that they're not willing to see and realize what's happening. But it's really amazing to me how long people will stick with it. I think talk to parents a lot now who are still trying to hang on to some idea that the trans thing is about compassion, and also they're seeing their kids get pulled into it. Not necessarily that they have kids transitioning, although I do hear from parents who are experiencing that too in heartbreaking ways. But even just that their kids become kind of militant apostles for the movement, and then they love their kid and they don't want to be at odds with them, and they don't want their kid to be mad at them, and these are powerful tools to kind of keep people silent. So I'm seeing a mix. I see people who will keep hanging out, and surprisingly so, where I just even recently had conversations with old friends that are, they still buy into all of it. And through, some questioning and some just conversation, they kind of were willing to hedge, and admit some discomfort. So I'm hearing from that, but I'm also hearing from people who have reached out and said that they are now naming it and they see it and they can't unsee it, that they were sold a bill of goods. And this is something that they now are really ready to kind of fight against, which is hugely encouraging.
It is. Yeah. And it's good to hear that they feel that they were sold a bill of goods, because we touched on it earlier. Some of this is a manipulation sales tactic, I would call it. So if you can recognize that, more power to you. That's good. And now you hear from people within the woke movement. They're not targeting kids. This is a right-wing talking point. This is a Tucker Carlson, a Fox News talking point. And then you see memes and photos and stuff taken in elementary schools. And it seems like maybe they are targeting the kids. First, I want to ask you about the trans stuff in a second, but I guess point blank, are they targeting children?
Yes, I think undeniably they are targeting children, and it's not accidental. And it's not, I think they give some kind of some sort of more plausible reasons for targeting children. One would be it's an anti-bullying effort. You want to expose kids to alternative lifestyles. That way they don't end up being bigoted against them. And then maybe secondly, you want to open up a door for kids who might be prone to some sort of alternative lifestyle. And so insofar as you expose them to those lifestyles, then you give them an opportunity to kind of express what's already in them. So those would be two of the reasons they would give. But I think more sinisterly, and it's written about aplenty in the literature, that innocence is a form of dominance, according to the movement. That insofar as kids are uncomfortable with a man with miniskirt and platform heels and, dancing and twerking and sexual, all these sexualized dances, their discomfort with that's kind of natural for kids is a perpetuation that there should be a norm in society. It communicates that there is something odd, because children are natural signposts to innocence, right? And to, we all understand kids to have that sort of innate kind of, that they've not yet been exposed to the sorrows and the horrors and the sadness and the, sort of perversions of the world. And so there's something really pure about them. But they have to be disabused of that innocence in order to really continue to smash the oppression of the moral law. So I think they're targeted in multiple ways. I also think their innocence in general stands in judgment of our own sins. When we are racked with guilt or shame, we kind of recoil from innocence. We don't want to see it. We want to make fun of it. We want to assume that there's something more sordid happening with that other person, that there's some, they've got some skeletons in the closet, because there is a way in which it makes us have to look at ourselves, and we don't want to look at ourselves. So I think for the movement as a whole, that's all built on sort of kind of finding pride in things that I think deeply, oftentimes people feel a bit ashamed about or worried, concerned about. I think that sort of that ideology institutionally kind of reacts against innocence in that same way that we do personally. But that it's the exact wrong approach. It's exactly spiritually. It's such a turning upside down of what the Christian call is, which is to look upon Jesus, innocent victim, and rather than want to project our own guilt, look at him and see ourselves more clearly in ways that both are ennobling but also are humbling. That we see our selfishness, we see our ego, we see our pride, but we also see his love. And so that it's a real facing of innocence that actually is the way out of our predicament of self-loathing and all of these things. But I think we humanly resist it. And I think the movement institutionally resists it. And that's why one of the more spiritual reasons why innocents and children in particular are targeted.
hmm And for some of the adults that are, I guess we could say, targeted, you mentioned nihilism earlier. There's kind of a shallowness, nihilism. We can use a lot of descriptors for this, but just a hole in people's heart. My friend Adam Patrick calls it a God-shaped hole in people's heart that just kind of exists throughout at least American society right now. And it seems to me that that's the people that can be preyed upon because they're looking to fill it with something. And again, this has some religious overtones to it, the woke movement itself. And there's kind of a flimsy, well, if I just join this, or I just post this picture or this ring around my profile picture, or put this sticker on, then I'm a good person. And it gains me likes on social media, and I can pretend that I'm doing something, and really, you're not doing anything. Do you see that shallowness within society, this kind of God-shaped hole, I suppose we could call it, that it's like an urge to be filled, and this, once again, it's easy, there it is, it's right there to fill the hole. Do you see that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you can see it in various ways. I mean, one being that, most of us, if we've lived life for, a little bit of time, have been wounded. That there's a lot of people that are really hurt and don't know how to heal from it. And so the ideology kind of gives you this sense of something. I analogize it to gang membership. Like the person who joins a gang is often preyed upon because he didn't have a whole or a happy family life. And he's looking for the things that a family should have provided: belonging, protection, loyalty, and identity. And a gang promises all those things. It protects you. It promises that they'll be loyal to you. It gives you an identity. It makes you feel important. But it's all built on complicity and sort of threat, rather versus a family, which is built on love and true knowledge of the human person. And there's an unconditionality there that is not present in the gang. So I think that there's something at work that's similar with this movement. But also, I think when you talk about the virtue signaling, virtue is really hard for all of us, right? It's really hard to do the hard work of trying to live a virtuous life and try to overcome our vices. And these are deep struggles. They're not glamorous struggles. They're daily, they're difficult. And the movement says, instead of that, you can just have the right ideas. You don't actually have to struggle against yourself, your selfishness, your vices. You actually just have to have the right beliefs and support the right causes. And that's a pretty attractive shortcut if I can get to virtue doing that instead of the hard and glamorous daily work of fighting my own will and conquering my own will. So I think there's something real there. And it's in some ways, socialism tends to be, or institutes an abstraction of virtue and abstraction of sin, right? So sin becomes not, my personal sins so much as sin becomes like systems of sin, But also virtue is the same way. Virtue becomes not, personal habits of excellence, moral virtues, intellectual virtues, prudence, courage, all these traditional understandings of virtue. Virtue becomes an abstraction too. It becomes, I have that social media flag, or I have that, I say the right slogan. Mm-hmm. And there is a shallowness there, as you indicate, that, and I think that shallowness is really a tool of the movement, is that the more they can habituate us to think in shallow ways, then the less we are likely to question the obvious lies that are at root in the movement. And so keeping people as shallow thinkers is effective for an ideology that's built on things that are fundamentally sort of a emperor's new clothes. There's not really a there.
Yes, no kidding. That's another theme I've touched upon on many episodes, is how long do people look around and see the emperor does indeed have no clothes, and there's just people just, no, he does. Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. But I wanted to read, I came upon a wonderful quote in your book. And actually there were several times where I just said, wow, and had to outline something. And this was so good, I wanted to put it in this episode, and then I'll let you further articulate it. But there are true ideologies faithful to the woke dogmas, but there is also a quiet, but likely not small subset of people who are repeating a script with little heart, as they are quietly pulled by design and desire to the possibility of deep meaning and hope, of some grand fulfillment, of an unidentified longing. Parroting woke indignance and all the correct ways by all the correct old things becomes tedious and thin. Everything bore us, and we become dependent on our outrage as the only emotion that we are able to access. In a carnival of pleasures, we don't have an architecture of meaning. These are shallow but tumultuous waters to wade through. Passions are sharp and consuming. Because we don't know how to suffer well, we suffer loudly. We are drowning in puddles when we should be learning to swim in oceans. It's beautiful, especially that last sentence. It seems like such a perfect description of the woke progressive movement, in my opinion. Drowning in shallow, meaningless puddles. Can you talk about that sentiment and what, I don't want to ask what inspired you to write the paragraph because I know you wrote it a long time ago, but it's so perfectly put. Can you kind of get into that sentiment?
Sure. I made a lot of points there. But I think it started out talking about people parroting a script, but while they're secretly being pulled by this longing of design and desire. Just that really is where I think a lot of hope, I think, can be found, is the fact that this is not, as you were saying before, the God-shaped hole. The thinness of ideology it's not even a drop in the bucket to the richness that the faith provides in fulfilling those real desires, as the only thing that can fulfill those desires is that in that intimacy of relationship with our Lord. And so we're invited into this, this deep and rich and wonderful, relationship that gives all the meaning that we're searching for. And instead, we're distracting ourselves with this thin, shallow ideology that there's just nothing to it, and I think there's something real there that the ideology really can only destroy. It can't build, it can't construct. It's a movement of destruction, not construction. And, that's similar to evil. Evil is a deprivation of being, right? Evil is not its own reality, or it's not being itself. It is just, all it can do is deprive being and chip away at being. And I think there's something really spiritually happening there where the movement is a rejection of being. And we even see that with the transgender stuff, just that I reject what is real, And so in that destruction, in that, privation of being, we're becoming, we're turning towards something that is actually nothing. We're becoming something that is, that nihilism that you mentioned. And, I picture it like the puddle and the ocean imagery. I almost picture it like, if you can think of, I don't know if this is getting too weird, but, a demonic, I picture like a demonic spirit is so defensive. So what's the word? Sensitive. So it starts with a P, darn it. Anyway, I hate it when I
No worries.
Once the slightest, assault on their ego is going to be something that is causing like this rage, or, and you could see this in sort of like a narcissism that, narcissistic personality, that an insult to the ego is, becomes like this mountain of offense. And, there's such a tediousness to that, right? We experience that on a human level, someone who's really prickly about his reputation or name or her, whatever, intelligence or beauty, there's something so boring about it, and we all are pulled into that but sin ultimately is extremely, extremely boring and tedious. It's monotonous. And I think we've been sold a bill of goods that it's the life of the really deeply human things that is boring, right? Like home life is boring, that being married, fidelity is boring, marriage is boring, that raising children is boring. These things are actually the most beautiful and deep and hard and challenging, but rewarding, and human parts of life. And this other stuff, the stuff that we're continually being pulled into, this idea that the ideology celebrates, these things are just tedious and boring. And so I think I was trying to kind of communicate that sort of something along the lines of that, that there's a reality there that is such a juxtaposition once you see both, between the richness versus the shallowness, but also that there is something that is going to be pulling at every human person by their desire for happiness. Every person desires happiness, but also by who made them and what they are made for, that they are made for something deeper. They're made for that ocean, not made for this puddle. Mm-hmm. And it feels like, that puddle is all that, we're swimming in at all times, but, we can be pulled out of it, that we can be, there's conversions that happen and, a turning to that can happen in a heartbeat, with the grace of God. So I think I was trying to communicate something along those lines.
Guys, I want to tell you about my friends over at the GOP Mises Caucus. And if you're looking to get some actual political steps taken and changes made, they are the cheaper, better, faster route. The GOP Mises Caucus. Recently, founder Andrew Pierce was on the Lions of Liberty show talking about how to privatize local governments and why the GOP is the necessary vehicle for that end. Obviously, you know this, nothing changes people's minds like money does. Andrew's strategy is to win over people's hearts and minds through their wallets by installing what he has dubbed the anti-tax, a DIY system of making taxation obsolete, which sounds pretty damn good right about now with inflation going through the roof. As you guys know, Andrew's anti-tax is the better, cheaper, faster strategy for liberty. He is not talking about taking over the GOP. Please understand that. He's talking about cutting taxes and privatizing local governments by leveraging free market competitive forces. This strategy can work in all 50 states for a fraction of what other organizations are getting it done with. I'm asking you guys, go over and support them. You can give per month $3, $5, $10, $1,000, whatever you want at misisgop.org/buck. Again, that is misisgop.org/buck. You can give monthly there. And again, this is for a fraction of the cost. They can get a lot done. So go over there, donate at misisgop.org/buck for the cheaper, better, faster strategy for liberty. And then you just sit back and let my friends privatize America for you. Let's get back to the show. Is there a move within the woke movement to emasculate men, or is this a separate thing that's going on within society? How does this fit into the wokeism?
Yeah, no, I think that that's such an important topic. It's interesting. The word emasculate or effeminacy, St. Thomas Aquinas defines as an unwillingness to suffer, unwillingness to forego one's pleasure for the sake of something higher, which I think is so interesting to think about. But I think that men have been targeted, particularly because the body of the man points them towards fatherhood, right? You know, whether that means biological or spiritual. I think it's similar with women that we think we can step outside of mothering, but we're actually, even if we are not biological mothers, most women, are going to be, using that kind of motherly skill in some way. And men too, whether it's through being mentors, through being leaders, being, maybe priests or dads themselves, that there is something in that fatherhood that is pointing us to the fatherhood of God. That this idea that God He's a father, not because it's not some anthropomorphizing of God, like that he is the father. He's the primary analogous. And human fathers are more fatherly insofar as they more closely mimic him. But that fatherhood is a real spiritual reality. And so I think, the father also represents authority. The idea of the good father, is this idea that authority is not intrinsically oppressive. And the movement wants us to look at any kind of structure of hierarchy or authority and immediately see oppression, right? That this is the old trope of how many movies have we watched or stories have we read about, some overwhelmed or overbearing, fundamentalist preacher father and the doormat wife and the kids who are, trying to be free of this darkness. But, if we don't have real fatherhood in our lives, we still know what we missed, right? And I think people long for that, right? And women want men who are competent, who are leaders, who are gentlemen. And, that's part of being of that good father, the real, robust understanding of good fatherhood and good manliness is that a man is supposed to be a gentle man, gentle and strong. And that gentleness comes as an overflowing of their virtue. It's not a gentleness that is emasculating or weak. It is a gentleness that he knows how to, take care of the people for whom he's supposed to take care of and how to, treat women differently than treating men. So yeah, I think that Marx really hated the concept of fatherhood and husband, stable marriage. And Engels would write about how, we need to make tomcats of men. Men need to be licentious, sexually licentious. And I think they're right that, targeting men, you really can corrupt a society as a whole, because once men are no longer willing to really be men in that kind of gentleman model, strong and virtuous, then women become calloused, right? Mm-hmm. I think that there's some way that when we are more biologically vulnerable, we bear children, we become postpartum, we're physically weaker. And so if we're not being protected in ways that we ought to be protected and cared for and reverenced in that sort of vulnerability, then we have to protect ourselves. And so women start to develop a hard shell around themselves. And then that furthers the cause of revolution too, because it makes women, allows them to kind of engage in like a whole host of sexual activity that their emotions kind of recoil from. But if you callous yourself enough, you can kind of do it, right? But it's not natural to state of women. Women have to kind of be ideologized to think that this is part of their liberation, is, being promiscuous with men who don't care at all about them, who won't maybe remember their name tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And somehow that's sort of an avenue to our freedom, even though it feels a lot like our exploitation. And then, to see ultimately that I think about this reverse, there's such a reverse engineering where, these feminists, when abortion restrictions come onto the table, they say they reverse engineer their way back into like traditional sexuality. Like, well, we're going to go on a sex strike. There's nothing more empowering than limiting your sexual activity to a man who is going to be there for you and be there for you for life. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that's better for women than that. But somehow we've been, trained and re-engineered into thinking that these are all oppressive things. So yeah, that targeting of the man targets also the woman, and also targets children, because once moral authority is eroded, then children tend to become rebellious, and that makes them ripe and ready to become ideologues as well. So yeah, it's an effective target, and I think one that is crying out to be restored.
Yeah, you wrote a great piece. I read something like the 2 types of men that the abortion debate has shown us, and wow, the sharp contrast between, I believe it was your friend, a person that you knew there with his kids at an abortion rally, and this pro-choice guy. I'm going to link to it for my audience. Just you guys have to read that because it's very telling. We've mentioned this a few times. This revolution's been waged quite effectively, unfortunately, through the institutions for a long, long time. I don't know that we have 80 years left for the good to win in this battle here. How can this be won? Will this be won? What are your thoughts? Are you optimistic at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm optimistic by nature. I tend to be a very optimistic person. I could see it going different ways. I can see, there becoming this increasing escalation of this movement, more, persecution of people who are maintaining kind of traditional values, and certainly decreased religious liberty. I think they're going to keep becoming more militant. I could also see it going a different way, where there is, that more and more people catch on to what's happening and, are willing to stand up and fight against it. And I think that I don't want to underestimate the power of that sort of natural kind of resistance to sort of something that is so contrary to our true freedom. But, obviously our greatest hope is that this is a spiritual battle and that God is stronger than the devil, to put it very simply and plainly, that victory is his. And so we should have all the hope and confidence in the world because of who he is. But we might have to suffer. So, that's what I think is that the suffering can get more, the militancy can get more escalated, can escalate, freedoms can be stripped left and right, and cultural pressure and the consequences of speaking out can become far more dire even than they are now. Right now they're pretty tolerable. I mean, you can get kicked off social media and stuff like that, which, that's a horrible injustice, and it's a rejection of freedom of our the American spirit of dialogue and discourse. But they could obviously become a lot more dire. So I think they can coexist. I think that they can get a lot worse, and then it can get a lot better. And maybe the worstness is the thing that will bring about a sort of spiritual revival.
Yes. Yeah, I think that too sometimes. I kind of cheer for some things to become so absurd that it just wakes more and more people up, as I believe this push for the trans thing's kind of done. And I don't even want to guess what's next down the totemic nature of, what's the next oppressed group coming out. I would love for you to plug any of your work, anything you'd like. Tell my listeners where they can go and find it.
Sure. I co-run a website called theologyofhome.com. We have a free subscription there, and we send out a daily aggregate of news stories, practical things, recipes, but then also spiritual stuff. So you can I usually repost our writing up on that website too. I also have a personal website, noellemering.com, and I try to update it pretty regularly with any new articles or interviews or things like that. So yeah, those 2 places are the best places.
And real quick, tell them, just obviously they know where you can get your book, but tell them title and just a 30-second elevator pitch for it.
The title is Awake, Not Woke, a Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. And it's sold anywhere that books are sold, even on, or we sell it on Theology Foam too, as well. And I guess the elevator pitch is that I think it's was shooting for a combination of accessible, able to be read by anyone at any kind of academic level. Even I hear from high school students who read it and were really kind of helped by it, but also substantial. So, I think that it feels meatier than, it might have, based on the description of not being an intensely academic book. So I think it's a good combination of accessible and meaty. And my goal was that it's, just give people clarity. I think that that's one of the things that's most important, is just seeing through what's happening, really understanding it, understanding the history, understanding this not come out of nowhere. And then once we have that clarity, I think we can really see how it operates, see how it manipulates, and then have kind of a courage and confidence in resisting it.
Excellent. Well, I will link to that book, of course, too, in the show notes page for this. Noelle Mering, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you again, Noelle Mering. What a good discussion that was. And thank you guys for joining me yet again on another week of the Counterflow Podcast. Everything you need to know about the shows over at counterflowpodcast.com. And again, if you'd like to watch this video and all of our podcast videos and not just listen to it in your car, if you want to watch us, just go to YouTube, type in Counterflow with Buck Johnson, and hit that subscribe button when you find my page, and you can watch all of these videos plus live streams that I do. You'll get notifications once you subscribe to it. So please do that. Follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And until next week, when I bring you a very, very good one, it's already happening. It's going to be a good one. Until then, have a great week. Enjoy your summer. Talk soon.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow Podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.